What do you get when Team Asano of Square Enix decides to combine the developer's penchant for epic, old-school storytelling with The Legend of Zelda? You get The Adventures of Elliot, the Millennium Tales. You play as a plucky and altruistic adventuring hero on a quest to save a kind and wise princess in peril whose fate is intertwined with that of her kingdom. You'll be joined by a naive fairy that talks just a bit too much. While questing across dungeons and caverns alike, you'll collect pieces of heart to increase your health, expand your bomb bag and arrow quiver, obtain a legendary glowing sword, and even explore a variety of shrines scattered across the land. Sound familiar? Don't get me wrong though, this isn't a mere Zelda clone copying Nintendo's homework. If you go in hoping for a game that plays precisely to the formula and style of a top-down Zelda, you'll inevitably be disappointed. However, I do think it's an interesting game to look at and examine in regards to where developers can go to explore and emulate Nintendo's long-running franchise. I want to make it clear, however, that this video isn't a traditional consumer-style overview. If you want to know my overall take, it's that the game is good, but it's not worth the full asking price of $60 US. The biggest problem the game has is repetition and padding. I'd say wait for the game to go on sale, and then play the 3 to 4 hour demo to get a sense of whether the game is for you. If you like what's in those opening hours, then I think you'll like the game overall, just not for full price. As for what this video will be, I'm going to reflect on what I think the game's strengths and weaknesses are, from its combat and exploration to its narrative. The combat and exploration will contain spoilers from throughout the entire playtime, so you'll see late game abilities and puzzle solutions that will help illustrate my points. When I get to the story, however, I'll split it between vague, early game observations before marking a specific, late to end game spoiler segment so those interested in playing themselves can go in as blind as possible. The gameplay shown will not hint towards overall narrative structure, which is why I'm organizing things in this manner. So if you want to go in as spoiler-free as possible and therefore will watch this video later, just know that things get better and more complex than what you've seen on screen so far, and that I recommend you play the game on a sale and, if you're a gamer with some mettle, give one of the harder difficulties a try. I played on hard myself and still didn't find it all that tough. I'll also be considering not only the overall qualities of the game's combat, exploration, and narrative, but how I think they compare to The Legend of Zelda. Where they faltered, but also where I think they do better than Nintendo's legendary franchise. So, let's get started. While The Adventures of Elliot has a lot of puzzles and exploration like The Legend of Zelda, the emphasis is far more on the game's combat. You'll be equipped with a range of weapons that have far greater use in the action sandbox than they do opening doors or figuring out tricky puzzle solutions. Their functionality is actually more comparable to Secret of Mana, where they have a regular attack and then a charge attack. As you find more powerful variants of each weapon, the amount to which you can charge that attack increases, as does its power. However, the real trick to your weaponry is in the magicite you'll find on your journey. A particular merchant will take the magicite pieces you collect and convert them into whole magicite with a variety of different modifiers and effects. From attack power and crit rates to freezing enemies or calling down bolts of lightning, the strength of your weapon is in part tied to how you customize it. I can be a boneheaded fighter type, so I tend to focus on attack power and critical hit rates, but there's a variety of magicite that emphasize status ailments, or even boosts received when swapping your weapons in and out. I primarily stuck to the sword and spear for melee, but no matter the weapon, no matter how plain it will start, it will possess a multitude of powerful effects by the game's end. In addition to weaponry, Elliot's fairy friend Faye will also be granted a variety of abilities whose primary purpose is puzzle solving. However, they'll also possess combat applications of their own, particularly after being upgraded. Combining Faye's powers with Elliot's weapons and magicite is what gives Adventures of Elliot a combat sandbox that Zelda doesn't really share, and is certainly the sort of thing I'd love for a Zelda game to better implement. More specifically, certain tools and gear in Zelda games become less useful as the individual game progresses. They'll be valuable in the dungeon you receive them, and perhaps a few overworld secrets to uncover, but otherwise lose their value inside of other dungeons. With Adventures of Elliot, nearly everything has a purpose, and I can easily see more skilled players than myself using them to even greater effect than I had. Bombs were incredibly useful not just in opening walls and revealing passages, but in taking out groups of enemies. I regret how late into the game it was that I thought to use Faye's Whirlwind ability to send a bunch of bombs into a minor, repeated boss to eliminate its shield, or to temporarily stun a group of beastmen. This is where the game really shines, as no matter your playstyle, you'll find some manner in which to combine the disparate elements into optimal tactical solutions. There's bound to be some trial and error, but it's rewarding to play a game where a touch of curiosity can result in tactical discoveries or advantages. In regards to defensive options, the player will have to rely on positioning early on as there is no dodge ability. Elliot starts off with a shield, but its block is limited until the player retrieves an upgrade that unlocks a perfect parry. A precisely timed block will take no stamina damage to the shield, and also stuns opponents or cancels devastating combo attacks, including on bosses. Nearly any enemy attack can be parried, including certain area of effect strikes. So while early on the shield is more of a desperate measure, it becomes an essential part of the player's kit the further and further you progress. However, there is no block cancel, and so the player needs to be careful with the timing of their attacks, as slower weapons will require a full commitment that cannot be interrupted with a desperate last-minute block. The final mechanic for the game's combat, and the greater incentive to avoid getting hurt, is the drop bonus that builds with a killing streak. Kill 5, 15, and then 30 enemies in a row, and you'll increase the odds and quantity of money, magicite pieces, bomb and arrow ammo, and health drops from enemies defeated. Early on, when the combat was more simple to start out, this is what kept me engaged. If you give me a kill streak bonus like this, then I'm going to want to pursue it and see how far it goes. For a while at least. Oddly enough, once I discovered the kill streak maxes out at 99, and that there's no bonus beyond 30, I stopped caring so much about it. Even if there was no more bonus to be gained after 30, the ability to test and see how high of a streak I could manage would have been enough to encourage me to keep trying. However, with the combat getting more challenging and more varied, combined with already having hit that maximum limit, I found no reason to keep chasing those hitless combos. The increase in challenge was already engaging enough. Nevertheless, the money boon is certainly important, as the more cash you collect, the faster you can upgrade your magicite box, which determines how many magicite you can equip per weapon. As I said, The Adventures of Elliot is a very combat-oriented game compared to The Legend of Zelda, and many of its systems work together to feed into improving this experience. You'll want to maintain a good drop bonus to earn more money, to purchase both goods and upgrading your magicite box, which increases the power and capability of your weapons, which in turn allows the player to take on more challenging dungeons containing more treasures, and so on. As I had also said though, I played this game on hard difficulty, and while there were some moments I died, well, see, that's part of the reason the game isn't that hard. Even if you die, you can just pay a fee to have Faye revive you within that fight. Each subsequent death costs more to revive you until you reach the next save station guidepost, upon which the cost resets. Given the most lethal foes you'll face are the bosses, you may as well just retry from the last save, which is typically right outside their chamber. I have not played on normal, nor have I played on the hardest difficulty. For me, I don't mind that I didn't die very often in Adventures of Elliot. In fact, I'd say it felt just right, as it provided just enough pressure and stress to encourage me to experiment and become skillful with its gear and weaponry. There were very few times I felt at risk of dying though. Additionally, if you collect all the vials in the game, you can just load yourself up with more than enough healing potions to get by any challenge. I would advise most players to challenge the game on hard mode. If you really want to be forced to experiment, however, and to use all of Elliot's tools and abilities to their maximum potential, then maybe see what the highest difficulty is like. It all depends on how willing you are to learn the ins and outs of the game's systems and ability to think outside of the box, but I can't imagine the lower difficulties encouraging any real experimentation at all if I was able to get by on hard difficulty with some of my equipment lying dormant for half of the game. Now, I spoke a lot about the different mechanics at the player's disposal, but I want to make sure I emphasize the wide variety of enemies within this game as well, even if it may not seem as such on screen. You'll see snails, what look to be flying slugs, crab-like and bipedal automatons, elementals floating about, and beastmen of the chicken, wolf, rat, elephant, and frog variety. Each of these species has colored ranks and reskins, but each species behaves differently from one another as well as within their own ranks. The green snails, for example, are the most simple enemy altogether. They creep forward and then slowly attack. The orange snails with bombs on their backs, however, can become area of effect weapons in your favor with a single arrow or phase ignite ability. There are purplish pink snails that, with every strike, spawn smaller variants of themselves, turning a single foe into a crowd. No other enemies behave like these do. Those crab-like automatons will charge full steam ahead, though if they collide with any surface, including your shield even before you get the parry ability, they'll be stunned. Other such crab-like automatons, however, will possess shields of their own with which they slam down on Elliot, or will leap into the air to perform a ground pound. These are two examples of the most simple species. The larger bipedal beastmen on automatons each have their own unique behaviors and attack patterns from one another as well. As the game progresses, the enemy species will be mixed together in more and more ways, requiring the player to try and come up with more diverse tactics and strategies on the fly, deciding who to prioritize and which gear and abilities would work best. Admittedly, writing the script, discussing the different enemies and opponents, it kind of makes me want to play the game some more, to experiment further, to see how much better I can exploit its systems to take on these challenges. I've said before that good combat is measured by the number of small, interesting decisions you make, and Adventures of Elliot pulls this off. Unfortunately, for as great as the game's combat is, the world itself simply doesn't measure up. Technically, the exploration in the Adventures of Elliot is pretty good. Early on, I was concerned that the different dungeons and caves will all have the same tile set, but as time progresses, the player spends more and more time weaving in and out of the different biomes and getting a feel for each particular location. While most passages and trails through caves and caverns will have the same art assets, the major dungeons will have their own unique look and interactive platforms. This is where that traditional Zelda element comes in, complete with push block puzzles, redirecting beams of light, and finding the correct switch to press and activate a platform. There are some ability-gated doorways and passages, but otherwise the player is surprisingly free to explore wherever and whenever they desire, which is also technically part of the problem. On top of enabling the player to become incredibly powerful very early on, negating a good chunk of challenge throughout the experience, it also introduces the game's habit of repetition and, dare I say, padding. Elliot travels across 4 separate eras of the land, a sort of combination between A Link to the Past and Chrono Trigger. Or at least it could have been. The problem is, whereas those games sought to create significant differences in the landscape and the dungeons in which you explored, as well as changes in one world or timeline impacting the other, the landscape of Philadelphia is unchanging across 1,000 years. There may be some branches blocking portions of water here and there, or the occasional obstruction that's not present in other eras, but every structure, bridge, and dungeon is in precisely the same place across a millennium. The only places that change significantly are the locations of the different shrines, and the central population center across the ages that would eventually become the Kingdom of Huther. Which isn't to say that you would fully explore each dungeon in each era. Most of them are more limited across the different time periods. A single floor with variations on puzzles or their layout to try and keep each trip rewarding. At least that's the attempt. The problem is the rewards themselves aren't always incredibly useful. While some of the treasure chests scattered throughout the land will contain a heart shard, a new piece of gear, a bunch of money, or a bunch of magicite pieces, you'll occasionally discover magicite that, so long as you're converting your pieces, will probably just be a chunk you've already received. These convert to just a single piece of magicite, effectively turning the treasure chest into a worthless dopamine hit, which itself is something The Legend of Zelda has progressively gotten worse with over time. I brought it up when I discussed playing the Minish Cap for the first time 2 years ago, but it's one of those things that have rather not been carried over from Nintendo's franchise. I'd rather all treasure chests be meaningful, that exploration is always purposeful and rewarding. Additionally, while there's a variety of interesting puzzles to solve, they're usually pretty singularly focused. Rarely do you have to combine multiple of Elliot's abilities in a single dungeon, nor do concepts like the spinning gears fuse with guiding light beams or platforms collapsing into magma. There's a minimum of ability-gating dungeons and caverns, so this is likely one of the reasons why. Like a modern Zelda, you're effectively free to explore any direction you want with very few factors inhibiting your freedom, which conversely means placing puzzles that rely on the bare minimum of gear and abilities in order to complete. This is where Adventures of Elliot has so much unrealized potential. The puzzles and world are interesting, but they don't become proper brain busters or anything, nor do they capitalize on the entire time travel gimmick the game's narrative relies on. Never does an action in the past have an impact on the landscape in the future, much as it would in A Link to the Past or Chrono Trigger. If there's a bridge in the future, that bridge is there in the past. The only hints that Elliot is impacting the timeline are in very minor additions or adjustments in the designated settlement of that era from completing side quests, such as the little Robo-Dog. This is a shame, because both A Link to the Past and Chrono Trigger provide a template for how to design a game with this sort of time travel. Have changes made in the past directly impact the environment in the future, and have a single dungeon crawl occur across 2, 3, even all 4 separate eras. Don't just gate changes based on abilities, but based on when you've been able to visit that area in the past. While the combat combines the player's disparate abilities in creative ways, the dungeons themselves rarely do so. The rotating gears in the Gear Temple are exclusive to just that location, and the earthen platforms that rise out of and sink into the magma are only in that dungeon. Imagine combining them so that there are rotating gears dipping in and out of the magma, their constant motion making it difficult to steer jumps and avoid the lava, or gears covered with slippery ice perhaps. They introduce a lot of neat ideas, but they are less thoroughly explored than a typical Zelda dungeon or world would explore its mechanics. The combat of the Adventures of Elliot may make better use of the player's abilities and kit than Zelda has ever really managed, as well as a wide range of opponents to keep combat challenging and interesting, but the puzzle solving and exploration of Elliot range from fine to good, but never as good as they could be, and not as good as the franchise from which it takes inspiration. Oh, and before I forget to mention, even if you set Faye's dialogue to be reticent, she still clues you into puzzle solutions the minute they appear on screen, so hopefully they can patch that. Playing in Japanese at least made it easier to tune her backseating out. For the majority of the Adventures of Elliot, the slowly unraveling lore is more interesting than the core plot or story itself. Additionally, much of the lore and narrative depth is only revealed by progressing through the side quests, which isn't necessarily a complaint or detriment. It's actually nice to play a game where, even if the mechanics of the side quest are simple or mundane, the context and content of the request develop the characters and setting further. This is where you'll start to tie connections between one era and the next, where you are witness to the invention of a key item in one side quest that you had already used in a side quest from a future era. Or, in some cases, you'll uncover hidden motivations or connections between characters either within that time or across those eras. Which isn't to say nothing is happening in the main story itself. In fact, piecing together who is descended from who before it all inevitably gets spelled out is a lot of the fun. It's just not necessarily compelling until the game begins to approach its third act. If I could summarize the core themes of Adventures of Elliot, it is unity. Unity through family, friendship, or community, the overall goal is to establish unity with one another. Some of the little sub-stories and character dramas that convey these themes are better written than others, as you'll often find character motivations ranging from believable to trite and forced. I'd say overall, I appreciate the writing in this game, but sometimes reading through dialogue of stubborn characters whose clash you know will end badly can be, well, it tests one's patience. However, there's a bit more I'd like to discuss regarding the very late game narrative. In order to do so, I will have to enter spoiler territory. So if you haven't played The Adventures of Elliot yet, but are at least curious enough to wait for a sale or play the demo, which is what I do recommend doing, then I'd say skip to the timestamp on screen and find out for yourself. If you ever wonder when the story picks up, it's in the final 2/3 of the game. When is the final 2/3? Well, when you think you're halfway through the game, you're really 1/3 through. When you think you're nearly finished, you're actually 2/3 through. Which, yes, is a long time until things start really happening, which is one of the reasons the game feels so padded. If they had streamlined the whole game into a 15 to 20 hour experience rather than the 30 to 40 hour one it is, I feel like it would work much better. Instead, the game ends up feeling padded out with the most interesting, emotionally satisfying events saved for the very last hours. So there it is, the timestamp. Skip to this point in the timeline if you want to play the game but avoid spoilers. So if you're even half clever, you'll start to realize each of these characters is the ancestor or descendant of another from across time. Elliot's friend Eugene is descended from Calatesia, who herself is descended from Marnie. Kaifried is descended from Baiken, who is descended from Icarus, who is descended from Kai. The king is descended from Hurek, who is descended from Hildebrandt, who is descended from Herc. Some of this gets blatantly spelled out, and some of it less so, but it's one of those things that I found interesting to unravel as I progressed through the game. Again, one of the most interesting aspects of the Adventures of Elliot is reading the different documents and piecing together the different lore as it connects through the characters and their side quests. What I appreciated most, however, is that each generation wasn't simply a clone of the previous. Well, except for Marnie to Calatesia to Eugene. They're all their own characters and personalities in their own right, but they're also all smart and scholarly with a good heart. The lines of King Hickard and Kaifried, however, were not what I expected, yet the journey of their genealogy makes a logical sort of sense, how the events of one era impact the other. Herc, for example, the first of the King's line, desires to protect her people by learning magic, even if it means completely upending their whole society. While she eventually learns a harsh lesson that leads to her working better with Kai, it is clear that her decisions in leadership and exploring magic lead to her descendant Hildebrandt in the Age of Magic, and the power that his institute wields over the nobles and land. Hildebrandt's pursuit of knowledge and magical possibilities lead him to unethical research that ultimately sets off the entirety of the game's conflict. This complete and utter disaster disgraces his name and institute and brings about great destruction to humanity, which leads Hurek in the Age of Reconstruction to have a more humble outlook. Hurek, simply wanting to help people and do good, ultimately leads the remnants of humanity to unite and rebuild, which leads to him becoming the Hero King, whose descendant would be the modern age's King Hickard, who carries on the values of Hurek. Kai, back in the Age of Budding, also learned a harsh lesson about tradition and being more malleable in your ways, which led to his descendant Icarus technically ruling over the people in the Age of Magic, but ultimately having less power over the people in nobility than Hildebrandt. An adventurer that continued to value his history, it was Icarus that sealed away the great threat in the Age of Magic that Hildebrandt had unleashed. However, by the Age of Reconstruction, his descendant Baiken was just a drunkard obsessed with his history and the library of documents he had inherited. Over time, his descendant Kaifried would be willing to sacrifice others for the sake of power, and both he and Baiken would recount how it was their lines that had sealed away a great evil. The true hero of that age, clearly envious of Hurek the Hero King and covetous of Hickard's throne. Both lineages had phases of stubborn conflict, of unethical villainy, and of heroism. In regards to the theme of unity, I feel like these dueling genealogies highlight that the past is something to learn from, but is not something that defines you. There is no good bloodline or bad bloodline, as both sides have performed acts of righteousness and evil. It is what you, as an individual, choose to do and be in the present, how you learn from the past, and whether you're willing to forgive the sins of others or repent of your own sins to forge a brighter future, which, ultimately, is at the heart of Elliot's own journey. I will leave those specifics, however, as a mystery. Needless to say, Elliot is effectively a typical, kind-hearted, altruistic sort of hero, and that ability to forgive no matter the harm done is core to his own arc and personality. I mean, honestly, the reason I can enjoy this story as much as I have is because it resonates a lot with my personal beliefs. I do believe in forgiveness so long as there is repentance. I do believe in unity, even if I, myself, struggle to find that compromise with others. Overall, I know that any peace or happy ending in reality is only temporary, but it's nice to have a story where you can pretend it can be everlasting. You'll have to work to get that ending in the Adventures of Elliot, though. Oh, you can certainly get unending, but if you want that proper, peaceful, happy ending, you gotta put in the legwork for it. I know I spoiler marked this part of the video, but I will not disclose that final third of the game. There's a lot of good stuff in there, things I'd even like to talk about, but you ought to have some degree of surprise should you choose to play. Needless to say, the story ultimately left me feeling very positive about this game in addition to the combat. It just took a while to get there. So there you have it, my thoughts on The Adventures of Elliot. I recommend it, just not for full price. Honestly, if we recontextualize this game to the format it would have been released in roughly 10 or 12 years ago, you know, as a 3DS or Vita handheld title, the repetition and padding would have been forgiven as just low-budget, handheld design quirks that plague the platform. It would have sold for $40 and would have been a big deal whichever handheld system it launched for, one of the greats of the time period. It's only because it is a console game, though admittedly handheld if you got it for Switch or Switch 2, that it is going to be sold for $60, and that it will be judged on the level of other larger titles out there. which it's hardly indie, what with being Square Enix and all, but for a smaller scale game of its nature, it's honestly quite good. It might even be my favorite Team Asano game that I've played so far. Regardless, I definitely think it is worth at least trying out. I'll reiterate that you wait for a sale, and once it gets a decent discount, boot the demo up and see for yourself. If you like it, buy the game and transfer your demo data. If not, then you know to skip this one. What's more, I hope the game is successful enough to get a sequel that can fix some of these issues and explore more creative mechanics in a way that Nintendo never would with The Legend of Zelda. If you're itching for a one-to-one Zelda-style experience, then this game won't really scratch that itch, but it certainly proves that you can take a lot of those basic Zelda ingredients and make a unique, solid title with its own identity. The Adventures of Elliot is good enough to warrant being a franchise of its own, should it prove successful enough, or they have enough ideas worth exploring. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again.